I'm hoping that you can now see my screen, and you should be able to see the title slide, which is the UK-Israel relationship, a match made in heaven. Now, I should confess to you right from the outset that I'm not going to answer that question. That is a question for you to answer, not for me. Alternatively, if you don't want to answer it, that's fine. Regard it as a rhetorical question. So let's get into the presentation because there's quite a lot of material to get through. As Tony mentioned, the relationship between the UK and Israel, indeed between the UK and Jews, has been a somewhat checkered one. And if we go right back to the medieval period, we discover that the first accusation of Jews against Jews of ritual murder, or the blood libel, as it's sometimes called, is usually traced to an incident in Norwich in 1144, where Jews were accused of murdering a boy, William, who was found dead with stab wounds. And a monk, Thomas of Monmouth, claimed that he had discovered an international council of Jews that every year chose a child, a non-Jewish child, to be killed during Easter. Some versions of the story suggests it's during the Passover Jewish festival. They coincide with each other, obviously, so very often. So both versions are probably true. And in a bizarre inversion of Zionism suggests that the prophecy requires the killing of a Christian child to restore Jews to the Holy Land. So that's not terribly pleasant as a way to start. So let's move on to something a little more positive, which requires us to go north of the border. So I've got a little quiz for you, for those of you who are interested in such things. I wonder how many Scottish references you can identify throughout the course of my talk this evening. Here's one, rather an obvious one. It's interesting that the Scottish National Party are very keen on quoting the Declaration of Arbroath, given that that declaration compares the Scottish people to the people of Israel, as you can see from the quote here. So talking of the Scots, the declaration says, "Thence they came 1,200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea to their home in the West, where they still live today." And it's really one of the great ironies, I think, that the SNP are one of the most anti-Israeli parties in Europe today, despite their pride in this particular declaration. The reason I'm showing it is that this declaration dates back 600 years before the Balfour Declaration, which Tony mentioned, and we'll come on to in just a moment. Before we get to the 20th century, let's just look at an interesting phenomenon that occurred in the 19th century, a form of Christian evangelical restorationism, as it's often called, sometimes called proto-Zionism. So this antedated modern Jewish political Zionism and was particularly prevalent in 19th century England. So there's the Earl of Shaftesbury was one of its supporters. And this was the idea that if Jews migrated to Palestine en masse, or at least achieved a critical mass, it's not clear which, that would hasten the second coming of Christ. Now, I don't know to what extent such ideas are still prevalent in Christian communities. I don't hear much of this kind of explanation nowadays, but certainly historically at that particular period, it was quite a popular cause. And there's the Reverend Alexander Keith, who was also involved in this movement, who coined the phrase, "a land without a people for a people without a land." This is a phrase that's often attributed to Jewish sources or to Zionist sources, but in fact, it's of Scottish Christian origin. It's a slightly double-edged sword that is used to cite this phrase, because it's often used by anti-Zionists to suggest that Zionists were somehow blind to the indigenous inhabitants that they claim are the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, whereas of course the Zionist view is very much that Jews were at least as indigenous and probably more so than the Arabs of Palestine. I can't resist really mentioning Daniel Deronda. I don't know how many of you have read Daniel Deronda. I read it relatively recently. I strongly recommend it. It's a wonderful yarn, quite apart from anything else, beautifully written. Those of you who've read any George Eliot will appreciate just how fine a writer she was. But it's interesting that she got hold of this notion of the Jewish people returning to their homeland. And she articulates through the character of Daniel Deronda a kind of proto-Zionism. And I've offered you a quote there. So please, if you haven't read it, please do read it, because it will give you a fascinating insight into this 19th century English view of Zionism. So let's move forward now into the 20th century, which is when we're going to be mainly focusing on. During the First World War, the tectonic plates of international politics were moving, and there was a growing consensus around a principle that President Woodrow Wilson of the United States had articulated in his 14 points, the idea of the universal right to self-determination. He made his speech in 1918, but it was clear that other leaders, including British leaders, were already aware of this political philosophy. And as a result, there was a feeling that after the end of the First World War, that something would have to be done to meet the aspirations of both Arab nationalists and Zionists. And that is indeed what we saw. So there was growing support for both of those movements right across Europe, and not just in the UK. The first promise actually that the British government made was to the Arabs, to the Sharif of Mecca, who was considered to be the leader of the Arab world at that time, via the correspondence with McMahon in 1915-16, and I won't read it out to you, but essentially what the British were doing were rewarding the Sharif for his support for the British in the struggle, the military struggle against the Turks. And what they said to him was that once the war is over, we will ensure that you will have a large Arab state, which will comprise most of that particular southern portion of the Ottoman Empire, with the exception of what subsequently became known as Palestine. That led to a lot of dispute and is still disputed to this day as to whether or not that British promise included Palestine. Anti-Zionists will say it included Palestine. McMahon himself later clarified that he was very clear to King Hussein that Palestine was excluded, and that he was sure that King Hussein understood that point very well. So that was the first promise. The second promise was made to the Jewish people, to the Zionists. And we don't need to dwell too much on this. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The key point about it was that it was a declaration of principle. It was a declaration of the view of the government. It didn't have any legal status whatsoever. All it stated was the government's view that Palestine should be established, or that within Palestine should be established a national home for the Jewish people. And we could spend a couple of hours parsing the content of the Balfour Declaration, which we're not going to do now, but it's an interesting subject in itself. So that was the second promise. And here's a crucial event which resulted in the British very early on antagonizing both of the parties to whom they had made promises, both the Arabs and the Jews. And this phrase, perfidious Albion, came to be used by both of them. Certainly the Sykes-Picot Agreement between Britain and France was a secret one. It came to light in the columns of British newspapers about a year later, a year after the agreement was signed, but it was never implemented. And what was happening here was that the victorious powers, the French and the British, had decided, regardless of the promises they'd made to the Arabs and the Jews respectively, that they were going to carve up the Ottoman Empire between them, because there was nothing in the Sykes-Picot Agreement that made reference either to an Arab state or a Jewish state. So that absolutely infuriated both parties to whom promises had been made. Nevertheless, events began to evolve in such a way that it became clear that the intention was that at least part of the Ottoman Empire would be turned into a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland, and part would be turned into an Arab state. But I want to draw your attention to something that happened before the Balfour Declaration. And this is something that very few people are aware of even. It somehow has got lost in the mists of time. The Balfour Declaration was not the first great power declaration in favor of Zionism. The first such declaration came from France, from Jules Cambon, who was head of an important section of the French Foreign Ministry, and it was issued in writing several months before the Balfour Declaration. And this is what Cambon wrote: with the approval of his government colleagues, it would be a deed of justice and of reparation to assist, by the protection of the Allied powers, in the renaissance of the Jewish nationality in Palestine, in that land from which the people of Israel were exiled. So there's the Cambon Declaration that really ought to have its place restored in the annals of Israel and Zionism. As I mentioned earlier, the Balfour Declaration was simply a statement of the government's view. It had no legal validity. What changed all that was the incorporation of the Balfour Declaration into the San Remo Resolution at a conference of the principal Allied powers. This was just at the time that the League of Nations was being established. The principal Allied powers decided that they would support the Balfour Declaration, incorporated it into the San Remo Resolution that is often called the Jewish Magna Carta. And as a result of an extremely complicated series of meetings and conferences, in the course of what collectively have become known as the post-World War I peace conferences, eventually the mandate for Palestine was handed to Great Britain. It was finalized at the Treaty of Lausanne, which marked the end of the Ottoman Empire. And that San Remo resolution actually provides legitimacy, legal legitimacy for Zionism, which is still valid to this day because it was incorporated into the UN Charter in 1945 under Article 80. It's no coincidence that just a few weeks before the San Remo conference, violence broke out. Well, that's one way of describing it. Actually, more accurately, violence was instigated by this character, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who is widely regarded by Palestinian nationalists as their first real leader. And then in anticipation of the San Remo resolution, which he realized was going to give international legal validity to the Balfour Declaration, he decided to stir things up by launching attacks on Jews in various parts of Palestine in 1920 and then in 21. And the British were already in the territory. Bear in mind that General Allenby had entered Palestine in 1917. And so the British were occupying Palestine prior to receiving the mandate from the League of Nations. So they were in control of the territory. They weren't able to arrest the Grand Mufti, Husseini, but they did sentence him to 10 years in jail in absentia, but then promptly the next year appointed him to the extremely influential role of Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. The reason I mention this character is that he was an out-and-out anti-Semite, an anti-Semite to the core. There's no doubt about that. In fact, he wrote an autobiography where he's quite open about it. He never demonstrated any remorse, for example, for his support for Hitler. And it's quite clear that he gave undertakings to Hitler that should the Axis powers win the war, that he, Husseini, would implement the final solution in the Middle East. So that was the fate that awaited the Jews of Palestine had Hitler and his ally Husseini won the war. Incidentally, Husseini's number two, Fawzi al-Kawuki, was also a Nazi sympathizer. Actually, he was a colonel in the Wehrmacht. Both of these characters, they were branded as war criminals at Nuremberg, but nothing was really ever done to apprehend them or bring them to justice. And they both spent their last years, both died at a ripe old age in Lebanon. That was one of the more shameful aspects of the post-World War II denazification process, that those two were allowed to get off scot-free. Okay, let's move on to the Palestine Mandate itself. I've already mentioned the role of the League of Nations, this new international body, the forerunner of the United Nations, created the mandates as paths to self-determination. It was quite clear that that was their purpose. Now, the Palestine Mandate that was given to Britain, as the term suggests, instructed Britain to ensure Jewish immigration and close settlement of the land. Those are quite explicit phrases within the terms of the mandate, which was eventually relinquished by the British in 1947. They just got fed up with the whole situation and left. To this day, there is a dispute as to what the borders of the Palestine Mandate were. And even amongst Israeli historians, there is a dispute about this. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, you can see there the original map of Palestine, which includes today's Jordan. And on the right, you can see the mandate, which has been divided into two, not into two equal halves. Nearly 4/5 was turned into effectively an embryonic Arab state, Transjordan. And I think what is interesting, I got these maps from the BBC. And I think on this occasion, we often criticize the BBC for their coverage of the conflict. On this occasion, I think they're spot on, because actually both maps convey a truth. The original mandate did indeed include the whole of what became Transjordan, today's Jordan, the Hashemite kingdom. But in the course of the evolution of the mandate between 1920 to 23, where at repeated international conferences, the British effectively rewrote the terms of the mandate. They were permitted by a clause in the original draft of the mandate to enable Transjordan to be created, which is what they did. But effectively, the Jewish national home was at that point confined to Western Palestine, west of the Jordan. And then follows a rather tragic history in which Britain retreated from the mandate. After having created Transjordan in 1922, they passed a series of white papers in response to growing Arab violence. Effectively, what they were doing was they were implementing the policy of appeasement, which ultimately led to the Second World War. By 1937, the situation had got so bad that the British set up a commission of inquiry, the Peel Commission, which suggested a second partition. That was the partition of Western Palestine. By this point, only 17% of Western Palestine was being offered to the Jews, which incidentally, the Jewish leadership accepted. It stuck in their throat, but they accepted it, whereas the Arabs rejected it. And that was a disastrous event because, well, had there been a Jewish state in the 1930s, maybe some of those doomed millions might have been saved. Then after the war, the United Nations General Assembly passed its partition resolution of 1947. Again, the Zionist leadership accepted it, despite the fact that they weren't going to get Jerusalem, they weren't going to get Zion, in other words, nor were they going to get the ancestral Jewish homeland of Judea and Samaria. But nevertheless, in the interest of peace, they accepted it. But as we know, the Arab leadership rejected it entirely, and that led to the Arab-Israeli conflict proper. There were two phases to that conflict. There was a civil war initially between November 47 and May 1948. And in May 1948, David Ben Gurion decided that he was going to declare Israel's independence, which he did, and in the process extended the hand of peace to the new state's Arab neighbors, which again, they rejected. As a result of that war, first the civil war, then the international war, a refugee problem was created. First of all, an Arab refugee problem that the Arabs call the Nakba, the disaster. And that led to around 700,000 Palestinian refugees fleeing, or in a minority of cases being expelled. Simultaneously, there were about 850,000 Jewish refugees that were kicked out of Arab countries over the course of the succeeding few years. So there was a Jewish Nakba, which has been pretty much erased from history in terms of the accepted narrative of this conflict. And in the course of the creation of the Arab refugee problem, the UN stepped in, created a special agency, UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Association, which was supposed to be temporary. It's the only agency that has been set up to deal with one specific refugee problem and has been maintained by the international community ever since. So now we're the descendants of those original refugees right now number nearly 6 million who claim the so-called right of return, for which there is no basis in international law. But they are led to believe that they have a right of return. It's a huge organization. It has received massive funding over the years, and it's become very much part of the problem rather than the solution to this conflict. Let's fast forward now to the Six-Day War. Just in case there's any doubt about this, those of us who were around at the time remember very well the bloodthirsty threats that were issued by President Nasser of Egypt, and indeed by other Arab leaders. And it was quite clear to the Israelis that they were facing an existential threat, and that was a war they really had to win. And they knew they had to win it, and they did win it. Now, that was another bullet dodged in terms of Jewish survival. That led in turn to the United Nations Security Council passing Resolution 242. And here I'd like to bring the focus back onto the role of the British, because as a permanent member of the Security Council by this point, the British, along with the Americans, drafted Resolution 242 in a very subtle and clever manner. Those were the three key principles. And the one I want to draw your attention to is the middle one there, a requirement for Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflict. In the French version of the resolution, which was a translation from the original version, somehow or other, I think probably there was some jiggery-pokery went on by the French delegation, but they inserted the definite article. And that's why, to this day in 2021, Israel's Arab opponents demand that they withdraw from all of the territories occupied in 1967, even though Resolution 242, which Israel accepted and the Arabs rejected, did not require that, but it required a withdrawal from some of those territories in the context of a peace treaty, which, as we know, has never come about. Okay, I'm going to fast forward again, closer to the present day. Meanwhile, over time, attitudes to Israel, especially so-called liberal attitudes to Israel, have hardened. Before 1967, I would say that most Western liberals were fairly sympathetic to Israel. After 1967, when Israel became an occupier of Arab territory, that changed. There was a rapid cooling of attitude. But bizarrely, despite the fact that Israel was the party that was constantly striving for peace, that was accepting UN resolutions while the Arabs were rejecting them, that was offering to implement some form of modus vivendi with the Palestinian Arabs. And despite the fact that the Palestinians were launching wave after wave of terrorist campaigns against Israeli civilians, the world nevertheless became first unsympathetic and then deeply hostile to Israel. And that's where we are today. And the question is why? There are many possible answers to that question. I just want to deal very briefly with three specific issues that a lot of people say explains that liberal hostility to Israel. First of all, there isn't a Palestinian state still. The issue of the occupation and the settlements, and finally of human rights. So let's just very briefly look at these three issues. In an ideal world, there would have been two states for two peoples. In fact, arguably, two states for two peoples were created at the time of the initial partition of Palestine in 1922. But clearly that wasn't going to work, and the Zionist leadership recognized that that wasn't going to work, and so has subsequent Israeli leadership, although some on the right of Israeli politics have talked intermittently about Jordan being Palestine, but it doesn't carry much traction internationally, nor even within Israel itself. It was the Israeli diplomat Abba Eban who said the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. It's not just a nice turn of phrase, it's actually a very accurate description of what has happened over the years. I've just presented you with a few examples there from the initial partition of Palestine right up to the Trump plan of last year, all opportunities to establish two states for two peoples, or at least to use them as a basis for negotiations. They've all failed as a result of Arab rejectionism. So that's a very bizarre reason to adopt a hostile attitude to Israel when it's Israel's adversaries who've repeatedly rejected offers of Palestinian statehood. Now, what about the occupation and the settlements? Well, Israel is far from the only country that is accused of occupying other people's territories. This is a list produced by Jewish Human Rights Watch of 16 disputed territories around the world. Most of them, well, I've certainly never heard of. I've heard of a few of them, but we don't hear about them. They don't get any coverage in the media. They're certainly barely even acknowledged, let alone discussed in the UN or any of its bodies. And yet the UN focuses disproportionately on Israel's alleged occupation. And that word disproportionate is not my term. It's the term that was used by former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon about the UN's obsession with Israel. And that disproportionate focus on Israel, treating Israel unlike any other state in the world, is in itself a form of anti-Semitism, if we accept the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And then the third of the three issues I flagged up, what about human rights? Maybe Israel is such a dreadful abuser of human rights that you can understand why liberal opinion would turn against her. Until one stops to think about where Israel is located. And it turns out that Israel is the only free country in the Middle East. It's the only full democracy in the Middle East. It's the only country which guarantees full and equal civil rights to all of its diverse communities. And yet, liberal opinion is not supportive of Israel, but appears to support many of her neighbors. So I'm just going to leave that question, why is this hostility occurring? I'm going to leave that hanging, and perhaps we'll come back to it later. The result of all of this is that the UN remains implacably hostile to Israel. Hillel Neuer, it's a name some of you may have heard of. He's the director of UN Watch, an NGO that tries to hold the UN to account for its bias against Israel and in many other areas as well. He says it's a matter of realpolitik. It's simply a matter of numbers. Because, and I'm not going to read this out, but you can see that what he's saying is that the Islamic bloc is so large that it can offer 56 votes to anybody who wants to acquire them in return for voting for resolutions against Israel. It's pretty cynical. Again, it's something that is not discussed in the media and is not acknowledged, certainly not by the British government. Then again, if we look at other UN institutions, I've mentioned UNRWA already. Even if UNRWA was funded simply to look after these 5.5, 6 million people, the few original refugees still surviving and their descendants, well, we may regard it as unhelpful, but we could understand that. But it's worse than that, because actually it's an incubator of conflict. It incites violence against Israel in all kinds of ways, primarily by delegitimizing Israel and refusing to acknowledge even that country's existence. So it's hardly any wonder that generation after generation of Palestinian children that are subjected to this kind of brainwashing become, when they grow into adulthood, deeply hostile to Israel, and it simply perpetuates the conflict. As for the Palestinian Authority that was established as a result of the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, well, they claim to be a state of Palestine. That's why Israel has been referred to the International Criminal Court by what is described as the state of Palestine. So one would have thought they would take some responsibility for policies that are antithetical to peace. And yet here we see the so-called pay-to-slay policy in action. This is a table which shows you how the salary of a prisoner in Israel convicted of terrorist offenses, often of murder, sometimes multiple murders, how the longer the sentence, which of course is commensurate with the number of people killed, the longer the sentence, the larger the salary that is paid to the family of the perpetrator. And these figures are out of date. Incidentally, they're substantially in excess of the average earning capacity of Palestinian workers. But these figures are, however generous they may look, are already out of date, because some of those numbers have increased just this month by around 50%. Okay, back to the UK. I had to provide some context for UK behaviour, but let's look at the UK voting record at the UN. If we look just at the period 2015 to 2021, that's February of this year, the UN General Assembly voted 112 times against Israel. On 3 of these occasions, the UK supported Israel. She abstained 27 times and voted against Israel 82 times. In 2019, the UK abstained on the charge that Israel committed war crimes while trying to stop an invasion, effectively a Hamas-instigated invasion from Gaza. And yet this is during a period of a conservative government which claims to be an ally of Israel, claims to be a friend of Israel's, claims to regard Israel's security as of paramount importance. I'll come back to the issue of the UN in a moment or two shortly before I finish. We're getting towards the end of the presentation now. I just want to mention a couple of other rather disturbing phenomena that scars the British political landscape currently. Something called Israel Apartheid Week is focused mainly on university campuses. There are currently around 30 universities which host Israel Apartheid Week. And this is based on essentially a propagandistic notion that Israel is comparable to apartheid South Africa and should be treated in the same way as a pariah state through isolation and boycotts. Of course, it's false, but to many of the young students encountering such assertions, they don't have the knowledge to be able to refute the allegations. A second phenomenon in which the UK has played a very major part is the so-called BDS movement, boycotts, divestments and sanctions. And let me make it quite clear, there is no such thing as a boycotts, divestments and sanctions movement against any country in the world other than Israel. Not against Iran, not against Saudi Arabia, not against North Korea, only Israel. And British NGOs have been at the forefront of establishing the BDS movement. It really kicked off in the year 2001 at the Durban conference, ironically called an anti-racism conference. And there are I've listed some of the NGOs that played a part in this. And very quickly, academics, trade unions and others jumped on the bandwagon. Now, BDS may sound like an economic movement, but its founder, Omar Barghouti, has more than once emphasized that the purpose of BDS is the destruction of Israel. It's about delegitimizing Israel, not just inflicting economic damage. It's often said that BDS has made no impact on the economy of Israel, and that may or may not be true. As far as UK-Israel trade is concerned, I have looked at this and got very confused, because on the one hand, we are told that Israeli exports to the UK have been rising exponentially. There's a headline from Jewish News just a year or two ago. On the other hand, this Statista website, that's a German website, highly respected collator of international statistics, shows the opposite picture. That UK imports of goods from Israel have actually been declining significantly since 2012. Well, I don't know about you, I'm not an economist. I don't think both of those statements can be true. So I'm concerned about this. I'm not at all as complacent as many other people seem to be about the impact of BDS. And it may well be that one or other of the sources of those accounts is flawed in some way. I don't have time to go into media reporting, UK media reporting of Israel. All I will say is that the BBC is regarded as the most authoritative news platform in the world, bar none. Survey after survey has demonstrated this. People trust the BBC more than they trust any other organization, whether it's Sky or CNN or French or German channels. So the question I'm posing, is the BBC biased against Israel? Many of us who observe BBC reporting about the Middle East feel that it is indeed biased. They deny it. This is a long-standing story which goes right back at least 15 years. And I think it's interesting that they set up an independent inquiry which published its findings, or it didn't publish its findings, it issued its findings, the Balin report in 2004. They've never been published. Repeated freedom of information requests have attempted to get that Balin report published, and the BBC have spent, this may be out of date, this figure, £330,000 in legal costs fighting that demand, and so it's still unpublished to this day. I think we can guess what it says. Michael Grade, who was chairman of the BBC, seems to know what was in it, because he says the BBC has shown inexcusable bias on Israel. So I think we have a problem with the BBC and with the media in general, but that's really for another presentation altogether. The effect of all of this, of all of these phenomena that I've been describing collectively on the British public, means that any British sympathy for Israel that used to exist has been eroded now, I believe, to a disastrous extent. So this was a survey that was conducted about 4 or 5 years ago on a sample of 5,000 adults. The blue segment of the chart there, 6%, shows the proportion of those people who say their sympathies lie more with Israelis. And the red segment shows the proportion who say their sympathies lie more with the Palestinians. That's 18 to 6. At one time, we used to talk about 10% on each side. We used to say, and I'm going back now many years, we used to say 10% of the British public were pro-Israel, 10% were pro-Palestinian, and the other 80% didn't know and didn't care. That is no longer the case, if it was ever true. It may have been true, but this is a worrying situation, and I can't see any sign that it's improving. Some people may suggest, well, this is all to do with anti-Semitism. What is true is that anti-Semitism is thriving in Britain today. Again, we know from the work of CST and others that around just under a third of the adult population in Britain harbor negative feelings towards Jews, amounting to prejudice, and that the number of anti-Semitic incidents, as monitored by the Community Security Trust, has been increasing steadily. I'm talking pre-pandemic, of course. So anti-Semitism is a factor. To what extent can anti-Semitism explain hostility to Israel? Well, I don't know about you. I've often resisted this argument that the one kind of leaks into the other. Clearly, the vast majority of anti-Semites are critics of Israel, but not all critics of Israel are anti-Semites. Nevertheless, and I'm quoting research evidence here, that there is a statistical correlation between people who harbor anti-Semitic views and who harbor hostility to Israel. It's not a direct match, but there is a statistical correlation. If you are a so-called severe critic of Israel, you are statistically more likely to be an anti-Semite than if you're not. Again, I'm not conflating the two. I'm not saying both are identical. Otherwise, that would be absurd because most Israelis would then be anti-Semites because most Israelis are critics of Israel. But what has happened now is that as anti-Semitism has been highlighted specifically in the British Labour Party, the pushback against that is to accuse Jews or the so-called Israel lobby of manufacturing anti-Semitism in order to protect Israel. This is the so-called Livingston formulation. The idea that Jews are behaving in bad faith, they're lying about anti-Semitism, and they are simply inventing an anti-Semitism crisis in the Labour Party in order to stifle criticism by Jeremy Corbyn, Ken Livingstone, and others of Israel. However, the Equality and Human Rights Commission clearly don't agree with that view. And as we know, their report suggests that anti-Semitism is embedded within, or was embedded at least within the culture of the Labour Party, which they said at best didn't do enough to prevent anti-Semitism and at worst could be seen to accept it. So clearly, this is more evidence of an overlap. That's, I think, as much as one can say about hostility to Israel and anti-Semitism. I want to finish now with a mention of this character who you'll be familiar with. I think Boris Johnson is somewhat of an enigma. I'm sure I'm not the first person to have said that. He is said to be the most pro-Israel prime minister in British history. In fact, he said it himself. He knows Israel well. He's visited many times. He worked when he was a youngster. He worked on a kibbutz and has maintained strong links with it. So what on earth is he doing attempting to maintain the nuclear deal with Iran that will allow Iran, even under the terms of the deal, to acquire nuclear weapons, given that Iran's explicit #1 foreign policy objective is the obliteration of Israel? Why does he continue to support UN resolutions that condemn so-called illegal settlements when new homes are announced, even in Area C? I mean, first of all, there have been hardly any new settlements in the last 25 years announced by Israel in the West Bank. But where there has been some new buildings is within Area C, which is under full Israeli control, and which under the Oslo Accords, Israel is permitted to build whatever she likes there. Now, you can argue that she shouldn't do it. There are good political reasons for restraint, but to call them illegal when they're clearly not, why is Britain supporting these resolutions? And we've mentioned the general anti-Israeli motions at the UN, which around 2/3 of which the UK has supported. If we look just last November, just a few months ago, Israel was condemned no less than 17 times by the UN General Assembly in that one month alone. And the UK supported those resolutions 13 times. So I'm posing, well, I'm just suggesting with friends like these, who needs enemies? And just to emphasize the point about Iranian foreign policy, something we don't see mentioned on the BBC or in other media, Iran has never once withdrawn its threat to destroy Israel. In fact, it keeps reiterating its threat to destroy Israel. They have something that they call the Hourglass Festival. And at the Hourglass Festival, they show the countdown to Israel's destruction. And as far as they are concerned, it's just a matter of time. The Supreme Leader has set a deadline of 25 years to Israel's destruction. So we've got about, I think that was the first one in 2018. So we're 3 years away from that. Nobody's demanded that Iran rescind this policy. So just to finish, let me try to finish on a slightly more upbeat note. I've got some breaking news for you from today. And this was a statement that Boris Johnson made in the House of Commons when he was presenting his integrated review of foreign and defense policy. This is what he said: "Our commitment to Israeli security is unwavering. And secondly, the government remains extremely concerned by Iran's influence in the region and its risk of developing a nuclear weapon. Does this represent a change in policy? Well, time will tell. Let's hope so." And the very final slide is a quote from Charles Mackay, a Scottish journalist, who was quoted by Nick Cohen, incidentally, a Guardian journalist. He talked of the madness of crowds, the idea that people go mad. When they're in the herds, they go mad and they only recover their senses slowly, one by one. I like to think that Boris Johnson is recovering his senses and that he and the rest of his cabinet will do exactly that, however slowly, one by one. Thank you very much. Thanks for your patience and your attention.